I'm really excited about this chat today. And what we're going to do is zoom out like a lot from some of the other things that folks have been talking about today and talk a little bit about the big picture of what kinds of work your data team does and how we can think about balancing sometimes competing needs. So just before we jump in, a little bit about me. I'm Caitlin Moorman. I'm the VP of Data at Trove Recommerce. The Slack icebreaker, if you will note, is about your oldest clothing item. We help brands and retailers create resale programs, which is very fun. But I've also been working with and leading various data teams for the past 6 or 7 years now. Before that, I spent almost that long in private equity building gigantic Excel models and not knowing what SQL was. So I've got some perspective on data challenges from a few different angles. And I'm also part of the leadership team of Locally Optimistic, which is a community for data leaders. So I spend a lot of time talking to other folks grappling with these kinds of trade-offs and kind of big structural questions about how do you do data as a team. And so the lens that we're going to talk through today is the idea that there is a fundamental tension on modern data teams between two very different types of work. And throughout this, I'm going to call these types of work proficiency-oriented and creativity-oriented. So let's start out just with a super high-level view of what those two types of work are. On the left hand here, you've got all of these sort of trappings of science and engineering and rigor. And that's what proficiency-oriented work is. It's what makes data usable and useful for the company as a whole. This is all the work around making sure that data is on time, accurate, reliable, building pipelines, ensuring robustness, the process and engineering behind what we're doing. I think in this audience, it's probably super duper obvious that this is important. If you don't focus enough on proficiency, you end up with data outages, you end up with incorrect data, you end up with all kinds of snafus that erode the trust of your users in the data that you're providing. The other side of the coin is what I'm calling creative work. And that is where you take data and make it valuable for the company, where you're adding impact. So creativity is leveraging data in new and novel ways. It's turning data into insights, turning data into action, creating new knowledge, building new products. All of those fall in kind of this creativity bucket. And this side of the work is also super duper important. An organization might have beautifully clean data and really reliable pipelines, but if no one is thinking about all the ways that that data can be applied, what they can learn about customers, how they can predict future behavior, how they can bring to light some hidden inefficiency, then they aren't getting as much value out of the data as they could. Creative work is also often what really gets your team fired up. Data is an incredible canvas, and you can do a lot of really cool stuff with it. You know, we're humans. We long for creative expression, as you have seen with the sushi metaphors and art history lessons and all the other ways we're kind of showing our well-rounded selves here at Coalesce. So if you aren't giving your team enough opportunity to do this creative work and really kind of stretch the bounds of what data does, then you end up with a team that's just not super engaged, potentially burnt out. So both sides of this are really important for making data valuable to your organization. So which comes first? Where do you start so that you can grow into the other? In case you haven't caught it yet, I really like this image to illustrate these concepts. I'm going to come back to it a few more times today. And I like it because I am a really strong believer that data needs are not a pyramid. That might be a hot take. That's about like as hot as my takes get. But you can't build a base of one thing. You can't focus solely on rigor and proficiency before you start adding layers of value-added creative work. These things really have to be in balance from the beginning. If you skip the proficiency work, you go straight to creative work. You're trying to pull insights out of the data. You're trying to build data products. Then you just don't have much to work with. You're going to deal with data chaos. You're going to end up with broken pipelines, wrong data, all kinds of bad things are going to happen. This is the reason the pyramid metaphor is popular. Without focusing enough on proficiency, then stakeholders get frustrated and disengage because they can't trust what comes out of the data team. That lack of trust makes it much harder for the data team to be impactful in the long run. If I don't trust the data to be right, why should I use it to make an important decision? Why should I take a minute to check the data when I could just make a gut decision, move on, go on with my day? But the other side of this is that if you start solely with proficiency-based work, focus on the pipelines, build a really robust data warehouse, it takes a long time to create business value. This is maybe a little bit less obvious, but if you take it to an extreme, you invest a bunch of time in building a rock solid data warehouse. You've got all the data your heart could possibly desire, but you're not taking the final leap of creating value from that data, helping make better decisions within your organization, getting to the insights that matter. Then you're in a situation where stakeholders get frustrated and disengage with the data team because the work that the data team is doing doesn't seem to be tied to the outcomes that they're looking for. So the key is to build a culture where both sides are consistently in balance. You invest in rigor, but you also see projects through and add that layer of creativity, take the analysis one step further, kind of really help people understand what you get with really robust data. So one of the reasons that I'm talking about this today and why I think Coalesce is particularly a great place to talk through this is because this challenge is somewhat new for data teams. And it's something that is increasingly important. Once upon a time, in what you might call the bad old days, these tasks were often performed by totally separate teams with very minimal linkage between them. Data engineers got the data where it needed to be, when it needed to be there, with a high level of accuracy. They built the transformations. Data analysts took that data and added value for the business. There was a hard break between the two. They nearly always reported into separate teams. And talking about these trade-offs just didn't have to happen on a daily basis. It's more of an annual headcount conversation. Are we kind of building the teams that can do these totally separate kinds of work? But as data tools have evolved and have become more empowering and data teams have evolved, the lines have become blurred. We work much more closely and interlinked, whether we report it to separate teams or not. You've got analysts and engineers maybe together, maybe separate, but the work that you do on a day-to-day basis is very different, and the linkages are much more important. So today we all often own a piece of each side, and it's thus much more important to build a data team culture that goes out of its way to make everyone aware of and embrace this constant balancing act that you're doing. So I keep using this word culture, which is a very fuzzy word. Sometimes it can be used for ill, but I think it's really important here because it's kind of the key to solving this challenge. This whole concept of creativity and proficiency cultures, what inspired this talk, it was a book called The Culture Code by Daniel Coyle. Coyle's argument is that culture is what enables a diverse group of people to rally together, take on really hard tasks, and ultimately achieve really great things. This is how you grow a great team. So Ford built a culture obsessively focused on repeatability and reliability. They are a proficiency-based culture. They're really good at doing the same thing over and over with a really high level of quality. Pixar built a culture super focused on ideation and thinking outside the box, and they are really good at doing new things constantly. They're a creativity culture. So where I break with Coyle is that he thinks these two, he considers these two mutually exclusive. You're good at proficiency or you're good at creativity. I think a modern data team has to be good at both all the time. The data has to be reliable, but you have to constantly be thinking through new applications of the data that can drive value for the company. Where do you apply this data? What do you do with it? How do you make it useful and actionable? And the culture piece really matters because the data team is making these decisions constantly. What should I work on next? Should I add a day to this project to refactor this really gnarly model that really needs some love? Should I send this data? It's exactly what the person asked for. Or should I spend some extra time building something that's a little more involved, but actually solves the business question that they're asking for and helps them understand what this really can be? And in those situations, the whole team is going to take cues from the team culture to decide what to do. So as a leader, initially, you have to kind of be the lighthouse and take a lot of concrete actions to help build this culture. Over time, it becomes self-reinforcing and the whole team ultimately takes ownership of it. So once it's baked into your team culture, it's not your job as a leader to be the one constantly negotiating this balance between creativity and proficiency. Everyone is thinking through it whenever it's necessary. So let's talk a little bit more about what each side of this looks like and kind of how to build that culture of balance. Starting back again with proficiency, how do you build that culture that encourages proficiency and rigor and quality? It starts with some of the basic analytics engineering best practices that other folks at Coalesce are sharing with you. We've had 2 really good talks today that are deeply in building the tools and culture that you need for proficiency. It's testing and monitoring, it's enabling high quality code review, it's thinking about scalability, reusability, and maintenance. But part of this is also making it very clear that everyone on the team owns this work. It doesn't belong to the data engineering team. It doesn't belong to one person. This kind of work is important for everyone. And as a leader, you have to explicitly assign value to this work. So if you have a career ladder, there should be visibility into how necessary this work is for advancement in every role. Proficiency work might look a little differently for an analyst versus an engineer, but everyone should be thinking about this as part of their career progression. And in a more fuzzy way, you should also just celebrate the proficiency work that's happening. New ideas, new processes, new tools that people have built to make this easier. Celebrate them loudly and proudly. I talk about data testing in our company all hands way more than is reasonable for the number of people that care about it. But it's a really good moment to publicly celebrate the work that people are doing that might otherwise be invisible. And then the third way that I found to be really key in just building this throughout your team and having it be something people constantly think about is to define user trust as a key metric for the data team. You can measure that via a regular survey that you might ask a bunch of other questions about your data team, but you just have to ask, do you trust the company's data? It's a little humbling often when you get the first results of that. So then you have a starting point and you can hold yourself accountable to improving that number. Or if you're, one of the very lucky teams who's starting from a good place, you're accountable to keeping it really in a good place. The other side, how do you build that culture of creativity? How do you help make sure that folks are thinking about new ways for data or for the data team in general to drive value in the business? Leading for creativity really requires a culture and systems that are focused on new ideas, even if not all of them are good. So you have to make spaces for sharing ideas, brainstorming sessions, casual discussions, just hashing things out in a very low-key way, because this can't be a situation where people are like pitching an idea where they've thought a lot about it and really invested in it. You have to start to build the muscle of just putting things out there. And you also have to build a high level of psychological safety and a high degree of mutual respect on your team so that everyone feels comfortable putting out an idea that isn't fully baked and knowing that people might say, oh, that's really interesting, but, and give them respectful and helpful feedback. Second, you've got to embrace failure. So it's important for us all to do the work we know will pay off. But it's also important to explore the work we don't know whether it will pay off. And when you're doing that exploration, you are going to have failure occur. You need to make that clear to the data team and to your stakeholders that you know that you're going into it expecting that sometimes it's not going to work out, but that you still learn a lot from a project that doesn't achieve its initial objective. And that knowledge is valuable, even if it doesn't look like you thought it would. You've got to empower your team. This is really around providing the support and the tools that folks need, and then trusting them to follow their instincts. When you have a team that's primarily reactive and doesn't feel that their leaders or their stakeholders trust them to go down the right rabbit holes or proactively design a new solution to a problem, then your team might get a lot done. You might finish a lot of tickets, check off a lot of boxes, but you're probably missing opportunities to exploit serendipitous discoveries. Empowering your team with that trust and with the right tools to do their job really makes a lot of this possible. And empowerment also includes making sure they have time for more creative work, that you're not so bandwidth constrained that everyone is just cranking things out and getting into that vicious cycle that Taylor and Emily talked about yesterday in terms of just never having enough time for things. That said, time is sadly not infinite. So we use time-boxed exploration that allows you to make space for creative work without letting these open-ended projects drag on too long. So set a timeline for a decision point and say, for example, I've got 2 days to work on this. And after 2 days, I will decide I'm done and that worked. And here's what we learned. I'm done and that did not work. And here's what we learned. Or I am not done. This is really interesting. I think there's a lot of value here, but I'm going to stop work, make sure that we've got a clear idea of the next steps. And this bigger project is going to get prioritized against everything else that we're working on because it's too big for us to do in a reasonable amount of time, but it is really promising. And so these two things are at times at odds, and there's a little mental stretching involved to just embrace the dualities of this balance. You've got to acknowledge and own those times when there is the appearance of conflict between proficiency and creativity cultures, and help your team become comfortable with both and kind of understand how to navigate those two things. So, I talked about both celebrating reliability and celebrating failure. I think it's important really to celebrate both of them, but to know the difference and to acknowledge the difference. So proficiency work, testing, quality peer reviews, rigor, all of these things, they protect us from predictable failures. So let's embrace and celebrate the work that goes into avoiding predictable failures. Creative work will sometimes result in unpredictable failures. You don't know when it will work or when it won't work, or you wouldn't have started on that project. That's okay. And these failures are good. It's just learning that you can't do it that way, or that this data does not support this kind of prediction, or whatever. You acknowledge that failure. You share what you did learn about the nature of the business. So wasn't what you expected, but here's what we know. Some teams actually go so far as to create a presentation. Here's my presentation about this failed project. Here's what we learned. Here's what we're not going to do again. Here's what we could do that might be interesting. Is it worth it? Is it not? Where do we go from here? And I think that's a really powerful thing to avoid that positive bias in what your team puts out in the world. The other hard balance is that there are no bad ideas, but at the same time, we have limited resources. So not every idea needs to go anywhere. Not every idea can get executed on. So there you get really into kind of this feedback culture and understanding what that means. So yes, encourage folks to share ideas early and often, but don't make them think that every idea is going anywhere, and don't sink too many resources into something that isn't high priority, that isn't going to add the value that you really need to be adding as a team. This is really around a culture of feedback where critiques are embraced as an opportunity to improve or learn. They're not considered negative feedback. They're sharpening the knife. They're honing the idea. And you have to help the entire team feel safe on both sides. Everyone needs to feel like they are empowered to critique others kindly, respectfully. And they also need to feel comfortable accepting critiques on their own work so that they can start to identify dead ends and future surprises sooner. So that's it. I solved it, right? No. This is just not a solved problem. I've led a couple of different teams through several kind of distinct phases of company and team development. And this balance is just a constant negotiation between competing priorities. It's dynamic, it's consistently challenging to get right. But I find this framework to be really helpful to think through the trade-offs that you're facing at any given time. And like, we're all here because it's fun to deal with ever-changing problems in a super dynamic field, right? Yeah, no. So that's where I'm going to wrap up. Thank you so much for your time today.